Hi all, and welcome to the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown. As much as we would have enjoyed hosting Professor Gayatri Gopinath in person here in Providence, the number of registrations for today's talk kind of remind us of the value of accessible virtual spaces such as these. So please feel free to use the Q&A function for your questions, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can after the talk. I'd like also to take a moment here to acknowledge the events that are unfolding in India at the moment and the kind of pain that many are experiencing, either watching from afar or at close range. I'd like to encourage you, if you are able, to donate to the life-saving mutual aid and fundraising work that's happening there in the severe absence of a state response. I'll drop a couple of links into the chat for places that you can donate, including giveindia.org and a mutual aid document that has ongoing kind of updating fundraisers that you can donate to based on urgency. And many do accept foreign funds as well. So I'd encourage you to do that if you are able to. I know Professor Gopinath will echo my saying how strange it feels to conduct business as usual in times like these, but we're extremely grateful for the opportunity to engage in this format, particularly with work as vital and as moving as Professor Gopinath's, which continually challenges us to rethink how bodies are oriented in space and time, how sensory experience, intimacy, and the everyday complicate our understanding of archives as stable or knowable sites of history. Professor Gopinath is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at NYU. She's published numerous essays on gender, sexuality, and diasporic cultural production in journals like Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, GLQ, Social Text, Positions, and Diaspora. Professor Gopinath's work, from her 2005 book, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas in South Asian Public Cultures, to 2018's Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora. I have the Zaban Books edition right here. Both these books have had a tremendous impact on multiple fields, from diaspora and postcolonial studies to visual culture and queer theory. Professor Gopinath's emphasis on the ways in which diasporic subjects and collectivities refuse claims of originary nationalism, compulsory sexualities, and authentic citizenship generate what she calls a queer optic, one that is purposefully ambivalent or resists indexicality. What I find most valuable and inspiring about Professor Gopinath's scholarship is the freedom with which her writing extends through an incredibly heterogeneous archive of its own, from film to poetry to photography and performance. The interdisciplinary and transchronological nature of Professor Gopinath's work, and of Unruly Visions in particular, is a model for a kind of academic writing that I think feels particularly necessary today. So with that, I'd like to invite Professor Gopinath to give her talk. And again, to remind our audience to please submit their questions via the chat, and we'll try and get to as many as we can after. Thank you, Professor Gopinath.
Well, thank you so much, Arnav, for that really gorgeous introduction. And it's so, I mean, I really wrote the book for you, for you and scholars like you. And so it's incredibly meaningful to hear your gloss on the book and that it's been useful for you. So thank you so much for that. Thanks also to Stephanie Abbott-Pandey and Grace Cardonio at the Center for Contemporary South Asia for doing all the legwork and organizing my visit. I'm very grateful to be here. And thanks, of course, to all of you for tuning in. And, as Arnav said, this is a time of, tremendous anxiety for those of us who have loved ones in India. And, those feelings of sort of helplessness and fear are very real and very intense. And so the fact that you're able to take time out to tune in, I really appreciate it all the more. So thank you for that. So Arnav asked me to talk about my latest book, Unruly Visions. And, my sense is that there are a lot of students on this call, a lot of graduate students here. So what I thought I'd do today is actually take the opportunity to trace the arc of the second book back to the first book, Impossible Desires. And I thought it may be useful to actually think about the trajectories of how we write, what we write, especially for those of you who are students, and for those of you who are graduate students and really at the beginning of your writing lives. So for me, at least, the first and second books are very closely interconnected projects. And, I really wouldn't have been able to write Unruly Visions without writing Impossible Desires. And in some ways I see Unruly Visions as a kind of extension of Impossible Desires. So what I'm going to do today is say a few words about the first book, then move to Unruly Visions, and then I'll end with a reading of an artist that I've just begun to write about, the Pakistani-American artist Shazia Sikandar. And, Sikandar is probably an artist that many of you who work on South Asia are quite familiar with. She's an artist of a great deal of renown. But what I hope to do today in my reading of her work is to show how the rubric that I lay out in Unruly Visions can productively defamiliarize her work in a sense. And it more broadly, give us new ways to think about work that we think we already know. So that's my hope, at least. So one of the first questions I ask my graduate students who are writing their dissertations is, what are the stakes of your project, right? What makes it matter to you so intensely? Because of course, what you're writing in your dissertation is going to live with you for many years, right? The dissertation is most likely going to be a blueprint for that first book that you eventually write. So, there has to be a real deep investment and a certain kind of urgency in what you're writing. And I think it's good to have that kind of clarity as you go into this project, because it is a long haul, as you know. So, for me, there was a real urgency in writing Impossible Desires. So let me see if I can share my screen, and then I'll talk a little bit about that first book. Okay. So Impossible Desires emerged out of my dissertation. And so, just as I said that Unruly Visions emerged out of Impossible Desires, Impossible Desires emerged out of my dissertation, which in turn emerged out of the kinds of organizing and activism I was doing in New York City in the mid-90s. So, the ways in which questions of race, of migration, of diaspora were being sort of contested and lived every day in the queer immigrant organizing that I was a part of, I really didn't see that being theorized in any way in the academy. And so that was really the impetus for engaging in this project and writing this book. So I had a couple of things that I wanted to intervene into as I wrote the book. And the first was, I wanted to intervene into sort of white, homonormative, Eurocentric, Euro-American-centric forms of queer scholarship that sidelined questions of race and migration. So I wanted to ask how foregrounding precisely those questions of race and migration made us think very differently about standard tropes of gay subject formation, right? Secrecy, disclosure, the closet coming out, visibility, invisibility, relations to home, relations to the domestic space, relations to the familial. And I also want to say, that I had many sort of fellow travelers in what was just being articulated at that moment as queer diaspora studies. It was very much an emergent field that I think me and my cohort were very conscious that we were actually sort of producing at that time. So, I want to give a shout out to some of those who really helped think with me at that moment. And I would say folks like Martin Manalansan, Jose Munoz, David Eng and others. So I would also say to all of you grad students, really pay attention to your cohort. You know this already, but they are the ones who are going to be in conversation with you for the long haul. And these are folks that I'm still in many ways in conversation with, right? So this is why, I began my book with a reading of this film, My Beautiful Laundrette. Screenplay by Hanif Kureishi, directed by Stephen Frears. It's a really brilliant film. It came out now 35 years ago. And I still think it's one of the best representations of queer interracial desire that we have on screen. So for those of you who may not have not seen the film, it shows this relationship between this white working class punk played by Daniel Day-Lewis and this young British Pakistani in Thatcher's Britain of the 1980s. And so in this scene that the still is from, you see that at precisely the moment when the two men are about to have sex, Omar actually abruptly calls a halt to the moment by recalling the memory of Johnny marching in a fascist parade when they were younger. And so I write of this moment: if for Johnny, sex with Omar is a way of both tacitly acknowledging and erasing that racist past, for Omar, queer desire is precisely what allows him to remember. Indeed, the barely submerged histories of colonialism and racism erupt into the present at the very moment when queer sexuality is being articulated. Queer desire does not transcend or remain peripheral to these histories, but instead becomes central to their telling and remembering. So my point is here, and thinking about the affective histories, which is the whole sort of theme or topic of today's talk, right? It shows, the scene and the film to me showed so clearly how queer desire is a kind of portal, right? It's a conduit to the excavation of these barely submerged memories and histories of race, migration, colonialism. Queer desire doesn't transcend this history. It in fact emerges out of it and through it. So that's why, the film I found very useful and moving in all kinds of ways. But the limits of the film is that even though it was so brilliant at sort of depicting queer male desire, right, it utterly sidelined female subjectivity, any form of queer femininity, queer female desire. And so, as I wrote in the book, Impossible Desires begins where my beautiful Laundrette leaves off, right? Which brings me to the second intervention I was trying to make in the book, which was into existing post-colonial feminist scholarship, and particularly Indian feminist scholarship. So, I found the work that I was reading, and remember, this was a long time ago, this was in 2005, and things have certainly changed since then. But I found that the work I was reading in the early 2000s was within Indian feminist work was so cognizant of gender as a kind of central node in the operations of power, right? In both colonial and post-colonial contexts. But it really ignored the ways in which the institution of heteronormativity, was also key to those operations of power. And so there was this kind of curious lacuna in feminist scholarship and in Indian feminist scholarship in particular that I was interested in sort of pushing against. And there was this very curious illusion in that work of female pleasure imagined outside the boundaries of heteronormativity. So, I really wanted to call attention to queer female bodies and desires. But, I was also trying to make very clear that this wasn't simply an inclusion project. It's not simply saying, oh, well, let's pay attention to this heretofore invisible positionality. What was at stake for me was to show how, in fact, queer female desire was a constitutive absence within conventional nationalist and diasporic discourses. These discourses could not exist without the elision of queer female desire. So what that meant for me is that articulations of queer female desire had the potential to disrupt, to challenge, and to explode these discourses. So this is why a film like Fire was actually quite interesting to me. It's actually the 25th anniversary of this film now. And, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, this was a film that was directed by Deepa Mehta, who was an Indian-Canadian filmmaker based in Canada. And it showed the relationship between these two sisters-in-law in a joint family household, middle-class household in contemporary Delhi. And, it was quite skilled at showing the kind of slippage from female friendship to female homoeroticism, right? So, the very predictable critique from the Hindu right at the time was that lesbianism was alien to Indian culture, right? But also that Mehta, because she was Canadian, was also foreign and alien and inauthentic, right? And so there was this very clear mapping of queerness onto diaspora, and both were seen as inauthentic copies, imitations of authentic national culture. So, you know, the book Impossible Desires was really interested in mapping that interplay of queerness and diaspora. So, you know, the film interested me for the controversies that it generated, and the ways it showed this kind of Hindu nationalist imagination and its framing of queerness as the inauthentic other, right? But the film also interested me more in some ways because I read it as a kind of diasporic translation of Ismet Chughtai's 1942 short story Lihaf, or The Quilt, right? And so both the story and the film, you know, situate queerness within the space of the home, right? And within the space of the domestic. And this is what I thought was really interesting, because I was really interested in pushing against the idea that queer desire, in order to flourish, right, has to always be ejected from home space, has to always leave the home space. So what I was really interested in thinking about is, you know, how does queerness actually remake the space of the home from within? So there's some very beautiful scenes in the film of the two women oiling each other's hair, massaging each other's feet at a family picnic, where they transform these kind of sanctioned modes of female homosexuality into homoeroticism. So, you know, I was really interested in thinking about, you know, how do you sort of work the traps that you're in, right? When you're within these kind of seemingly oppressive structures that are in fact not totalizing and not hegemonic, right? So what I was interested in doing in the book was in fact articulating what I called a queer diasporic reading practice, right? That allowed us a different kind of optic, right, through which to read queerness outside of Euro-American context. And so, you know, through this kind of queer diasporic reading practice, we can see that, you know, queerness may in fact look like hyperbolic, excessive femininity, as it does in this sort of classic Bollywood film, right? And so, you know, through that queer diasporic reading practice, we can read femininity not in fact as a marker of one's availability to heterosexuality, but in fact one's refusal of it. So, you know, a film like Razia Sultan was interesting to me. It came out in 1983, of course, because it allowed me to think about how we can actually read the codes of popular Indian cinema in order to decipher the queerness within it. And often queerness would emerge within these sites of extreme gender normativity, right? Like the Zanana, for instance. So, you know, in thinking about queer archives, right, I was really interested in thinking about how queer audiences, in fact, identify a queer archive within popular Indian cinema, right? And they do that by seizing onto these moments of queerness that erupt, in fact, in the sort of gaps and fissures of heteronormativity. And they make those then the building blocks of queer identification and spectatorial pleasure. So another example, you know, some of you may remember this film, Hum Aapke Hai Koun, which, you know, was probably one of the most popular Bollywood films of the 90s, and, you know, deeply conservative, extolling sort of family values, narrative kinship ties, capitalist consumption, right? And then in the midst of all of this, you have this one moment where a cross-dressed character dances with, you know, engages in this very flirtatious dance with Madhuri Dixit, and then sort of disappears from the entire scene of the film and is never seen again. But so, you know, I was interested in identifying those like moments, as I said, of queer incursion, right? These kind of brief moments that interrupt the apparently seamless quality of heteronormativity of the rest of the film. So, you know, a queer reading practice seizes these moments and takes them further than they would want to go, in a sense, which is precisely what queer audiences do with these moments, right? Do with these scenes. So, you know, I'm giving you the sense of you know, the kind of stakes in the first book to show you that, you know, ultimately, you know, this book, Unruly Impossible Desires, as well as Unruly Visions in a lot of ways, is really not interested so much in these kind of excavations of the dominant, right? I'm really interested in alternatives and possibilities. And I think that's really what I've tried to do really throughout both books. So let's move on now to Unruly Visions. So I hope you got a sense from, my brief gloss of Impossible Desires that, visuality has always been really central to my work. And of course, the question of visuality is precisely the focus of Unruly Visions. So as I argue in the book, the politics of vision, what we see, how we are seen, has always been central to the workings of colonial modernity, right? And so both books are really invested in creating a kind of queer feminist frame that allows us to really see the intimacies of these apparently discrete geographies, temporalities, social formations. So as I write in the book, an abiding legacy of colonial modernity is that it has instituted a way of seeing and hence knowing that obscures the interrelation of imperial, racial, and settler colonial projects as they produce racial, gendered, and sexual subjectivities. Through a sustained engagement with queer visual aesthetic practices in particular, we can identify alternative ways of both seeing and knowing, capable of challenging the scopic and sensorial regimes of colonial modernity in their current forms. So in both books, I'm trying to articulate a queer diasporic theory of visuality. And in Impossible Desires, when I named a queer diasporic reading practice, was in fact a practice of seeing, right? It's a practice of looking in a particular way. So, a queer diasporic frame, right, allows us, as I said, to see queerness, right, across difference, whether that difference is racial, geographic, or temporal. And similarly, in Unruly Visions, I'm mobilizing what I call a queer optic, as Arnav mentioned, right, that brings into focus these intertwined histories that traverse the South Asian diaspora, but that also exceed it. So, this is where I think the book in some ways departs from Impossible Desires. In Unruly Visions, I'm really interested in thinking about the intertwining and the intimacies of these different diasporic trajectories, not just South Asian, right? So the book begins and ends, in fact, with the work of a contemporary queer Lebanese artist, Akram Zaatari, whom I put into conversation with South Asian texts, but also with African-American, with Latinx, with Indigenous work. And, Arnav mentioned the kind of heterogeneous nature of my objects of study. And that's something that I've done sort of quite deliberately in some ways. And it's a real challenge in a lot of ways to work in that way. But I feel quite committed to that way of working. So the book's method is in fact juxtaposition, or what I call in the book queer curation, right? Where I juxtapose seemingly incommensurate texts to make apparent the resonances between them. So there are different layers of curation in the book. I see the artists themselves as curators. So in Zaatari's case, for instance, he's working quite literally with an archive, right? He's working with the photographic archive of a studio photographer named Hashim El-Madani, who was from Saida, which is Zaatari's hometown in South Lebanon. And here Madani created literally hundreds and thousands of images of Saida's residents as he took photos of them from the 1950s through the 1970s. And so what Zaatari does as this contemporary queer artist is to choose particular negatives from this vast collection that El-Madani has in his studio, right? So he chooses these negatives, he prints them, he arranges them, and then he places them back into circulation in the contemporary moment. And in doing that, of course, he gives these images a different kind of meaning than they had when El-Madani took them, right? So that's one way in which curation operates in the book, is the way in which the artists themselves function as curators. And then, of course, the other level at which curation functions is that I, as a critic, right, I'm also doing a particular kind of curatorial work by placing these artists in relation to one another. And so putting Zaatari's excavation of El-Madani in conversation with, say, Saidiya Hartman or with the work of Alan D'Souza brings out other valences in the work that it wouldn't have had otherwise, right? So the introduction to the book is titled Archive, Region, Affect, and Aesthetics. And it's really the interplay between these concepts that's really what the book is about. So what I'm calling the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora are in fact archival practices, right? Because they excavate these sort of alternative visions of the past that allow us to glimpse other possibilities in the present. And you know, when I talk about Sikandar's work, I think you'll see that at work in her work as well, the ways in which her art practice is also a kind of archival practice, right? That allows us to glimpse other possibilities in the present. I also, in the book, I also mine the space of the region as one that we can effectively sort of go to for alternative logics of gender and sexuality. So in the book, I deploy the region, the notion of the region, in both its subnational and supranational senses. And I argue that, you know, these aesthetic practices transform regional archives into queer archives, right? And it does so through the mobilization of affect, right? And you see this again very clearly in Zaatari's work, right? Because it's through his own investment, right? His own excavation, his own curation of these archival images that gives them a kind of queer meaning in the present, right? So, you know, I'm interested in that sort of mobilization of affect between the art object and the viewer, right? So, and this is why Zaatari's work figures so prominently in the book. So here's the book of photographs that Zaatari created from El-Madani's images. Most of the images are of, you know, of what you might expect, of weddings, of babies, right? You know, what you might expect of a studio photographer at the time, right? But what Zaatari chooses to reproduce from this archive are some of these images, but they're also very specific, right? There are images like this of a kind of homoerotic, homosocial masculinity that is also a kind of militant revolutionary masculinity. So he has a whole series of images of, you know, Syrian resistance, Palestinian resistance, right? And he has talked about how, as he was growing up in Saida, right, that, you know, these resistance fighters, these revolutionary men, were actually the objects of his desire and his identification as this kind of queer child, right? And so what he's doing by sort of replicating these images and putting them back into circulation is to give them precisely that kind of queer valence, right? So, you know, he's very clearly sort of queering a certain kind of history of revolutionary heterosexual masculinity. But more interestingly to me is how he then articulates the ways in which this history is always shadowed by its negatives, right? And so at the end of this entire series of these hyperbolically masculine men and this kind of militant masculinity, you have this series of Abeda Taylor, right? And you know, it's a series that I absolutely love. And you see here, right, these images of Abed, who he only talks about as, you know, this tailor, Abed the tailor, that's all we know. But we have then a whole series of images of Abed with friends, right? With his sister, right, in the same pose as his sister, right? And so you have a sense of this, of queer existence in a way, right, that is absolutely unremarkable and unspectacular and just kind of woven into the fabric of everyday life of this town at that moment. And so, you know, clearly, Zaatari has a kind of affective relation to Abed, right? But I also, as a critic writing in, you know, in 2000 and whatever, and, you know, encountering this image, right? Sometime, I think I first saw this image sometime in 2016 or so. I also have an affective relation to this image. And so that's why it became the cover of my book. You know, this became the cover of my book because, you know, to me, that gesture was so familiar. You know, there's something so queer about the style and the gesture of this figure, right? That for me took me back to, and this is what I opened the book with, you know, it reminded me of, you know, walking on the piers on the west side of Manhattan, you know, in the 90s, and, you know, just reveling in the beauty, the sort of queer femininity of the queens that I saw on the piers, right? So, so there's all these kind of affective relations happening as Zaatari puts these images back into circulation, obviously between him as the artist and the image, but then of course with us as viewers encountering these images, right? So as I said, you know, what I think Zaatari is doing by ending that whole series of images of masculinity with these is to point to precisely, you know, the ways in which even a kind of recuperated history of revolutionary masculinity is still shadowed by its negatives, right? Gender queer figures, you know, queer desire itself, right? And gender non-normativity. And then of course, female subjectivity, right? And so, you know, if we have time in the Q&A, I can talk a lot more about these images, which I also found extremely striking, that he calls Scratch Portrait of Mrs. Bakari. And so to me, you know, it points so clearly, right, to the ways in which female bodies, female subjectivities are sort of wiped out of a particular kind of triumphalist telling of history, right? So, so that's, you know, that's what I was trying to, you know, tease out in my reading of Zaatari's work. But Zaatari also allowed me to get at, you know, what I'm calling a queer regional imaginary, right? And so, you know, in Zaatari's work here, the region you can see deployed in its subnational sense, right? And, you know, I'm interested in how this work seems to be suggesting that, you know, there may exist alternative gender and sexual formations that exist in this kind of imagined space of the region, right? That get then occluded within a kind of nationalist historiography. So what I think Zaatari is doing is sort of excavating a regional photographic archive of South Lebanon in particular to bring its queer valences to the fore, right? And what he seems to be suggesting is that the story of the region is not the story of the nation, right? That there can be something, there can be, not necessarily, but there may be something, right, queer about the region in that it's out of step and out of time with the temporality of the nation. And I think this is what, you know, an artist like Zaatari is trying to excavate for us. So, so as with my first book, you know, what's at stake for me in this book is imagining alternatives, right? At, I think, a very grim moment of history that we find ourselves in. And so I find myself turning to the aesthetic as a site of possibility, one that makes evident our sort of the kind of commingling of our past, of our presence, of our potential futures. And to me, it's in the space of the aesthetic that we can see these connections that are typically obscured, right? And these are connections across geographies, across social formations, across temporalities. So this book is very much about entanglements. It's about overlaps, intimacies, intersections of these histories and geographies. So in that sense, I think it's very much part of a collective project that many of us as queer studies scholars are enacting in our work. We're sort of excavating those intimacies in order to imagine other possibilities of organizing social life. So ultimately, this book is really about radical relationality, right? The ways in which our lives are and our fates are deeply intertwined with all other beings, right? Human and non-human around us. And if the pandemic teaches us anything, it teaches us that, right? And so what I was trying to do in this book is to surface the unexpected connections, interconnections between apparently dissimilar formations. So with that, I'm going to turn to the work of Shazia Sikandar. And forgive me, I'm suffering from allergies, so my throat is getting a little scratchy. So radical relationality, I think, is a really good segue into talking about Sikandar's work. And so I'm going to end with a reading of her work. So as I mentioned, Sikandar is probably one of the most prominent contemporary artists from the South Asian diaspora working today. She's been making work here in the US for close to 3 decades, since her arrival from Lahore to New York City in the early 90s. And, Sikandar, as you probably know, is trained in the incredibly labor-intensive art of Indo-Persian miniature painting. And she works within this idiom in order to both pay homage to it while radically deconstructing it. So in a lot of ways, she was the first, right? A lot of people now use that genre, that idiom of Indo-Persian miniature painting in a kind of contemporary frame, but Shazia was really the first one to do that. And so for those of you not familiar with the genre, here are some, kind of quite typical 17th century examples. And here is what Shazia does with the genre. So on the one hand, if we are thinking sort of conceptually and thematically, the address of her work is against Orientalist framings of South Asian and particularly Muslim women within the US, especially at this moment in time. These are images, these are paintings that she did in the mid to late 90s. And at the same time, she is just as invested in disrupting these fixed notions of culture, tradition, authentic national identity upon which nationalist regimes in South Asia depend, right? And of course, I'm thinking particularly of Modi and the BJP in India. So interestingly, Sikandar was not an artist I wrote about in either book, in either Impossible Desires or Unruly Visions. I was in fact commissioned to write about her work after Unruly Visions was published for a collection that's coming out that just came out. Here, I'll do a plug for it. It's a beautiful book that just came out in conjunction with her, with a retrospective of her work at the Morgan Museum in New York City that's going to take place in June. So I really appreciated the opportunity to revisit her early work. So the retrospective is really her work from the 90s to the mid 2000s. So this kind of looking back at Sikandar's early work really allowed me to think about its heightened resonance today, as we're dealing with these sort of extremist forms of nationalisms that are so sort of viciously resurgent, both in the US and in India. So, the commission then, to write about her work was an occasion to reconsider her work through the rubric that I lay out in Unruly Visions, right? And so, as I mentioned, she's an artist, of course, I've been very familiar with and I've long admired, but I never thought to write about her because she's typically been written about as a feminist artist, but never in relation to queerness, right? Never in relation to queer studies, right? So what I realized in my reassessment of her work is that how putting her work in conversation with queer studies, right, and viewing it through the kind of queer optic that I suggest in Unruly Visions actually brings to the fore aspects of her work that haven't really been talked about or fully, I think, fleshed out or excavated before. So in fact, I've come to see her work as very much fitting within the rubric of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora that I articulate in Unruly Visions, and their mapping of affect, archive, region aesthetics. She's very much offering us a different mapping of South Asia as a supranational region. And, to my mind, she's laying bare the arbitrariness of geopolitical lines of control, right? And she radically disrupts taken for granted national boundaries, temporal boundaries, art historical boundaries. And I'm going to give you a sense of how that works in some instances of her work. So, I would say that Sikandar's work traffics in what I would term promiscuous intimacies. And, that's the title of the catalog essay that I wrote for the collection. So the word promiscuous is derived from the Latin miscere, meaning to mix. And we can understand Sikandar's work as promiscuous in the sense that it surfaces the intimacies, the deeply imbricated nature of apparently discrete aesthetic and cultural traditions, histories, and geographies. And so in that sense, I think it really enacts the kind of radical relationality that's at the core of all the work I write about in Unruly Visions. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of Sikandar's early work. So this is a piece entitled Venus's Wonderland, created from 1995 to 1997. And, I would really read this piece as indeed a kind of wonderland of queer utopian possibility, to cite my beloved late colleague, Jose Munoz, right? And, I'm sorry the image is so small. It really bears, close attention to look at the details of these images because, of these paintings, because as viewers, we're immediately confronted by this kind of riotous assemblage of figures, right? Both human and non-human, that quite literally spill out of the frame, right? And what we see, in fact, is this kind of disorienting collision of these multiple art historical traditions and cultural vocabulary. So remember, the title of the piece is Venus's Wonderland, and Sikandar is very clearly playing on Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And you can see elements of Botticelli's painting in Sikandar's painting. So here you have a torso with the same gestures of Botticelli's Venus, but covered in this sort of curious shredded veil. And here, very faintly, you see Botticelli's Venus shadowed in the water alongside this female profile in this kind of Mughal style, right? So, you have here this kind of palimpsestic colliding, right, of these images of archetypal femininity from all kinds of traditions, Islamic, Hindu, Christian, pre-Christian mythologies that are quite literally fragmented, layered, submerged, obscured, entangled with each other, but also with earth, sky, water, and these non-human entities. And so, just pay attention to all of these sort of curious creatures that surround these equally curious, half human, half not, more than human creatures. So to me, what I think is so wonderful in this painting is that gender as a kind of stable category of identity is really exploded, right? And what we see instead is a kind of radical interspecies relationality and interdependence of human and non-human, animate and inanimate worlds. And so the veil, which is of course this totally overdetermined, fetishized marker of Muslim feminine identity, here it's shredded into tendrils, it's rendered in white and red paint so that it both obscures and reveals simultaneously. And of course, veils here cover both human and non-human creatures. And what that does is render their meaning as gendered signifiers absurd and nonsensical. So there's a real kind of explosion of gender that happens here that I think, doesn't fully get excavated when critics talk about Sikandar's work. So this is another painting that I want us to, pay attention to briefly. This is Sikandar's 2001 painting, Pleasure Pillars. And here again, we see a kind of signature juxtaposition of archetypal feminine forms from different art historical traditions. You have dancing women straight out of Indo-Persian miniature painting that are flanked by a pair of headless torsos, again, a Venus, right? And a Hindu goddess. And then you have a self-portrait of the artist's own face, crowned with these enormous spiraling horns that floats above the torsos. And in a sense, this head serves as one head that kind of connects the two torsos. So to me, what Sikandar here is doing is suggesting that her own aesthetic genealogy draws from multiple religious, cultural, and geographic traditions of female pleasure, potency, and eroticism. But you also have here this kind of chilling insertion of these two winged entities at the top of the frame, right? You have this kind of streamlined fighter jet and a dragon-like creature, perhaps out of Persian mythology, right? Emitting fire from its limbs. And as I understand it, Sikandar added the fighter jet to an earlier version of the painting in the direct aftermath of 9/11. And so to me, the painting's representation of gendered bodies takes on a particular valence in the context of imperial war and carnage at that very start, at that moment, the very start of Bush's so-called war on terror. And, I think it's really important to remember that the human rights justification of the war, of the invasion of Afghanistan, was in fact to save Muslim women from Islamic extremism. So Pleasure Pillars, to me, speaks back to such paternalistic discourses and insists on resurfacing submerged narratives and genealogies of pleasurable, sensuous, and joyous gendered embodiments. But as with Venus's Wonderland, right, the painting cannot be entirely contained by a reading that simply sees it as celebrating women in any transparent sense. And so this is why I'm pushing against the sort of standard feminist reading of Sikandar's work. The spiraling horns in the artist's self-portrait disrupt any such attempt. Sikandar's so-called women are in fact fragmented, opaque, disjointed, hybrid entities that refuse wholeness or bodily integrity. And a recurring motif in her work, and I'll see if I can find it here, is this, right? The outline of a female torso, but the female torso has roots for feet, right? And you see that repeated here in this image as well. So to me, Pleasure Pillars, and indeed all of Sikandar's paintings, suggest, in fact, an alternative architecture of gender. They resist the grid and straight lines of gender and sexual normativity, and instead they spiral, they loop, they scatter across multiple temporal and geographic terrains. So here's the final image I want to show you. This is from Sikandar's most recent work, her very first sculpture. This is her working in a totally new medium, entitled Promiscuous Intimacies from 2020. And Sikandar, in fact, titled the work after the title of my essay, which I can honestly say there's no greater joy as a critic than to have that kind of give and take with an artist that one writes about. So Shazia, if you're listening, if you're on this call, I just want to say thank you so much for that lovely gesture. It's tremendously meaningful. So you see here, I just wanted to show you the kind of source material in some ways for this sculpture. We again see here these images of archetypal femininity, a Greco-Roman Venus lifted from Bronzino's famous 16th century painting. You see her sinuously intertwined with this Indian Devata figure from the 11th century, right? So the figures are quite literally dependent on one another. They cannot stand without one another. And there's clearly this kind of desiring, sensuous, erotic relation between the two figures. So to me, the sculpture produces the art historical archive as in fact a queer archive, right? Sikandar is mining this art historical archive to envision queer female embodiment and desire that draws from these multiple art historical genealogies and traditions. So to my mind, there's really no better representation of radical relationality than this sculpture, right? Our irrevocably intertwined, interdependent connection to the other across time and space, which we access through queer embodiment and desire. So to me, this is in fact an instantiation of what Munoz terms queer utopian possibility, that backward glance that enacts a future vision. And to me, Sikandar's backward glance offers us an indispensable, expansive vision of a more livable future that embraces the promiscuous intimacies of our shared past and presence. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so hopefully we have some time to engage in discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. That was really incredibly generative, and thanks for giving us both a trajectory of your work through your books, but as well as kind of an insight into your interventions of method. And I think the queer diasporic reading practice as a kind of hermeneutic is so immediately useful in so many ways. And so we actually have lots of questions in the chat, and I'd like to kind of give space for a couple of graduate students, colleagues of mine here at Brown, who have questions as well. First is Karim Estefan, who is a PhD candidate in modern culture and media here.
Great. Hello, Karim. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you. Thank you so much for such a rich talk. And I really appreciate also your generous framing for us as graduate students in particular, and, you know, raising the stakes of writing our first major projects. So along those lines, I want to ask you about one methodological move that I think is, you know, really fascinating and generative in your work, which is the queer regional imaginary that you're describing, and how the region points to both the subnational and the supranational. Wow. I'm writing on Palestinian visual culture, but you know, through Lebanon, through Syria, through the region, of course, because you know, both Palestinians and Lebanese and now Syrians too are largely diasporic populations. And so my question is basically, you know, how you approach sort of expectations around area studies and disrupt some of those, and more broadly, you know, how also the subnational interacts with the supranational to you, because, you know, I really appreciate in your reading of Zatari that you're looking at, you know, South Lebanon, and also, of course, by looking at Saida, you're looking at Ain El Helweh, which is, you know, the largest Palestinian camp in Lebanon. And so in a way, you're also inhabiting a space of Palestine. And then, you know, just also speaking about the arc from your first book to your second book, there's a, you know, broad move outwards, very global comparisons. So it's, I mean, I guess this is kind of a comment I'm just turning into a question. If you can speak more about the regional as an intervention into area studies, into diaspora studies.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. So first of all, I want to say I love the sound of your work, and I'd love to hear more about it. So it sounds like a wonderful project. So you know, you had asked about sort of area studies expectations. And I think that's something that I was really trying to grapple with in this book and sort of push against in some ways, because I've always had a kind of eccentric relation to South Asian studies. And particularly as a diaspora scholar, I think we do have eccentric relations to area studies. And that can actually, rather than being a source of concern or insecurity, it can actually be a source of strength, right? And so for me, you know, what I was trying to actually do by trying to articulate, you know, what these aesthetic practices can give us is to really push against these kinds of area studies formations. So, Zaatari, for instance, the very fact that I'm even entering into thinking about Lebanon, right? I'm not trained as an area studies scholar in relation to the Near East or the Middle East. And so I had a lot of trepidation sort of entering into a reading of the work and to do it justice. Because of course, I don't speak or read the language. So that's a huge problem. And what area studies training does give you is precisely that, which is so necessary, right? So if you're somebody like me who's actually invested in sort of pushing against the boundaries of area studies, right? But nevertheless, is also always trying to be very careful to the historical specificity of these sites, then, you have to be very careful in how you approach this work. So the way I do it, or I try to do it, right, is to start with the art object itself, right? And then to see what, how it demands a kind of deep history, right? That you cannot actually understand this project without understanding its deep history in relation to the Palestinian diaspora, in relation to Palestinian refugees, in relation to all these histories of displacement that a space like Saida in South Lebanon is completely marked by. So for me, Saida then became I saw it as a kind of diaspora space, right? So in a lot of ways, the art object itself, right, allows you to recognize that those area studies boundaries have to constantly be sort of remapped and shifted and pushed. But I would say, you can get to it from the art object itself, So I do the same kind of work. Let me see if I can get to these other slides. This is the work of Tracy Moffat, right? Who's also somebody I write about in the book. She's an Indigenous Australian artist. And, I came across these images. I was struck by them. They're they're collages, right? But I didn't fully understand them. And then I started getting into it, right? Understanding what is Cherbourg? What is this place? And then I came to understand, doing historical work on it, that this is in fact a so-called Aboriginal settlement, right, from 1925, where her own family was relocated to. And so that then demands that you engage with the history of Indigenous dispossession and ongoing settler colonialism, and put that in relation to the reading that I was doing of the work, which is, can we understand Moffat as both an Indigenous artist and a diasporic artist, and how are those things actually congruent rather than incongruent, right? So, this is going back to, this is all to go back, Kareem, to your methodological question of like how to do this work. And, for me, starting with the art object and having that sort of expand outwards and then also go deeper is kind of the way I think about it. I'll also say, that what I love about somebody like Zaatari's work is that it is both subnational and supranational simultaneously in a lot of ways. And so, some of his documentary or, video work, right, really sort of has the kind of more bird's eye view that takes on the space of the region more broadly. But then he also sort of goes down into the subnational. And so a lot of work that I'm looking at in this book actually does both and moves from the subnational to the supranational. So I'm really interested in Shiba Chachi's piece from 2007 called Winged Pilgrims that I think gives us a whole different mapping of Asia as region. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm so glad, Kareem, that you sort of picked up on the ways in which the work is sort of engaging and pushing against sort of area studies frames simultaneously. And I would say for you as a Palestinian scholar interested in Palestinian visual art, I think you could make some really important and necessary interventions into area studies. I mean, just the nature of you know, the diaspora demands that, don't you think?
Yeah, thank you. And also, I mean, I appreciate your sort of pushing against the, you know, authenticity of still being in the place versus the diaspora. Those tensions are also, of course, really important for a place like Palestine, where some people are living under occupation, some people are living in camps, some are fortunate enough, like me, to have gotten citizenship elsewhere, but are still marked by these histories of displacement. And so, you know, thinking around all those different ways in which diaspora and indigeneity, as you said of Mafat, you know, create other types of spaces and relationships to space.
Completely, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, thinking about a space like Saida, which seems so rooted, right? It seems so particular and local. And of course, it's completely marked by these histories of war, displacement, diaspora, right? And so I think that's what I'm trying to do in all my work, is sort of bring all those valences to the fore in this apparently sort of rooted location, right? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kareem. We have another question from another graduate student here at Brown, Kiran Saili, who's a PhD candidate in the English department.
Hi, Kiran.
Hi, Professor Gopinath. I can't see myself on the screen, but am I up on the screen?
You are. You
okay,
are.
Great. Thank you for the talk. And to echo Kareem, the intervention, and Arnav also, the interventions that your work makes and kind of loosening up how we as graduate students can then come and do area studies, can come and do queer studies, diaspora studies, has been so useful to me. I have, you know, 2 books that I can hold up to a supervisor who tells me to be, you know, more historically, politically specific.
Oh, I'm so
with love, not one.
Cursing me.
Sorry?
They're probably like cursing me.
My question is maybe a bit of a fangirl question, but I think there's something very different to me about the eye of Unruly Vision versus like the writing eye of Impossible Desires. Since you mentioned that you kind of are tailoring this talk towards grad students and writing, I feel like maybe this is a okay question to ask, but I just have a broad question about your process. Like, what was it? Was that a decision for you in your writing process the second time around? Was there something vulnerable or, you know, scary about doing so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Karen, I so appreciate that question, and I'm so happy that you picked up on that, actually, because there is a real difference, you know, and you know, there's a long time between 2005 and 2018, right? And I think in the first book, you know, I reread the introduction to Impossible Desires before giving this talk. And, you know, I realized, you know, on the one hand, I was very like thinking of myself as like a young scholar. I was like, you go, you know, you go, girl, you know, because I was like, I was trying so hard to be very careful. You know, I was very careful in that introduction. I was trying very hard to sort of, you know, be clear about the terms and the interventions I was making, you know, because I knew, right, that this work would not be received with, you know, it wouldn't be seen as legitimate in area studies worlds, in the, you know, I came out of English and comparative literature at Columbia. It wouldn't be seen as a straightforward English department project, right? So I was trying really hard to kind of carve a space out for the work. And so I felt like I had to, it was very deliberate, you know, like every word is very deliberate. And I think, you know, in Unruly Visions, that's true too. I think that's how I write. I write in a very deliberate way. But I was allowing myself to be a little freer and a little looser, and to allow my own subjectivity to actually emerge in the work more explicitly. And you know, so I have like little autobiographical moments, right? Like talking about being on the piers in the Hudson, on the Hudson, or you know what the space of Kerala means to me, you know, as a diasporic person, and you know, so those moments that that do feel more vulnerable, right? And do feel a little bit more self-revelatory in some ways. But I also felt like I didn't have the pressure anymore to be proving myself to these standard disciplines, and to argue for the legitimacy of the work. And, once you let go of that, right, there is a kind of freedom in what you can draw on. And I think, Arnav, you mentioned this, there's this kind of freedom in in this kind of very unruly archive that I assemble, right? And I felt like I could do that because, I wasn't interested in proving the importance of the work anymore. I was taking that as a given, that it's important to do queer work, it's important to do diaspora work, and that now in 2018, when I wrote the book, when the book came out, this is an established field. And, I said, when Arnav did the introduction, I meant it when I said that, this book was written for you. It is written for you. It's written for all of you graduate students who are doing queer work, who are doing visual culture, who are sort of, have an uneasy relation to, area studies perhaps, are doing diaspora work. And I really want you to feel legitimized and authorized to do that kind of work. So that's really where it's coming from. So I have to say, like, I took more pleasure in writing the second book in some ways, because I didn't have that sort of legitimizing super ego sort of hanging over me in the same way. I will say though that also has a lot to do with the fact that my whole career has been, situated in interdisciplinary departments. So I actually think it's interesting that it's not interesting. I think I'm not in an English department, and I think in some ways that also gave me a certain kind of freedom to do this kind of work. Does that get at what you were thinking about, Karen?
Yeah, totally. I think, like, just from creeping your footnotes and the kind of people that you cite, it was really cool to see you bring something like a queer of color critique kind of genealogy. If we think back to like Audre Lorde, her use of memoir and the biographical, and how her memories too and her descriptions of them are so mediated, perfect, like purposely artistic. And to see you and your work also take up questions of enabling nostalgia, and here I'm quoting Impossible Desires, versus like disabling nostalgia, and thinking about your use of, or your focus on visuality, and your insistence that there is no unmediated visuality, and your clear kind of like flags throughout your book about this being your reading of something, and the impossibility of ever discovering kind of like the full context or meaning behind an image. And the turn to like family photograph and like partiality. It was really cool. It was cool to see all those kind of strains articulated with affect theory in a way that was distinctly diasporic, distinctly interested in race, always referencing itself in that way.
Thank you for that beautiful read, Karen. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that kind of gloss of both books. And I'll say, you mentioned Audre Lorde and, the kind of work that I was drawing on. And I would say that, in addition to my contemporaries who were doing this work, I was completely enabled by the work that somebody like Jackie Alexander has been doing for decades, obviously, Unruly Visions is so indebted to the work of Lisa Lowe, and thinking about affect, other queer scholars like Anne Svetkovich, right, An Archive of Feelings, like all of that work has sort of, I've taken all of that, and really drawn from all of that. But I appreciate you mentioning the ways in which I approach the visual, obviously not as unmediated, right? So as always mediated. And so this is something that I was sort of struggling with in relation to this figure of Abed, because on the one hand, as I open the book with, there's a sense of, oh, I know you, like that immediate sense of recognition of a kind of I think I call it the kind of trans-temporal queer relay of identification, right? And at the same time, of course, Abid is unknowable. I don't know what their gender embodiment meant to them, right? I can only presume, right, how they inhabited the social world that they were in, right? And some of the other work that I look at is even more explicitly sort of problematizing the visual as transparent. So I just want to quickly show you this work from Alan de Souza. You had mentioned family photographs, so I just want to quickly show you these. This is from his series, The Lost Pictures. And, he takes these family photographs of, that moment of Kenyan independence in the early 70s, right? Late 60s or early 60s. I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking. But, he grew up in Kenya as an Indian. And, to me, the ways in which he completely obscures the family photograph, right, is so fascinating to me, because he's quite literally sort of instantiating the fallibility of memory for us and the ways in which we can never access, right, the truth of the photograph, right? So he's constantly undoing a sense of like the indexicality of the photograph, right? So yeah, so I'll just stop there. But thank you. Thanks, Kiran.
Thanks, Kiran. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have lots of questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can, and we'll try not to keep Gayatri here for much longer. But I think so the first question comes from Ketan from Ashoka University, who asks, I've always been interested in the negativities in your title, or the negatives in your title, rather. Your focus on the unruly and the impossible is central to your thinking of queerness. How do you then read your work on queerness in relationship to scholarship around queer negativity or a queer skepticism towards futurity? Is negativity a threat to relationality? Is there something useful about negativity that is central to the way the social is formed?
Yeah, I like that question. Thank you. I would say that, in some ways, I think I want to, and maybe I think I'm old school here, because I do want to hold on to queerness as a kind of pushing against, right? And a kind of transformative possibility that is sort of doing something else, doing something different, sort of inhabiting that space of negativity. So, when I talk about unruliness and impossibility as these sites of productivity, I really want to hold on to queerness as that place of possibility. I'm obviously very cognizant of, the framings of, homonormativity and the ways in which LGBTQ can simply sort of feed into a certain kind of normativity. So that's a given to me, but I'm much more interested, as I said throughout this talk, in sort of trying to glean the possibilities, the alternatives. And so for me, queerness and precisely that space of the negative, which is why I think, Zaatari also talking about Zaatari's sort of damaged negatives are quite interesting to me, because it really is this kind of, the kind of shadow side of history, So he calls this whole series damaged negatives, right? And this one is called Scratch Portrait of Mrs. Bakari. And so to me, the negative is precisely that which cannot be written into historiography, right? That which escapes our standard tellings of history. And so to me, it's in the aesthetic that we sort of are able to sort of glean those negatives, right? That can then open up these other possibilities in the present. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Siddhant Iyer Sikera. Siddhant, thanks you for sharing your work, and then is wondering how you are engaging with caste in your scholarship. Siddhant writes that narratives of queerness and the South Asian diaspora are often articulated only through a Hindu upper caste lens or an upper class lens. Just this year, filmmaker Deepa Mehta got into hot water for erasing and flattening nuanced considerations of caste, class, and ethnicity in her adaptation of Shyam Selvathurai's Funny Boy, with members of the queer Elam Tamil diaspora boycotting the film. How are the unruly visions of diasporic queerness interrogating ideas of Brahminical caste hegemony that are so pervasive in academia, mainstream media, and within South Asian diaspora as well? Is the queer feminist frame that you are posing caste inclusive or abolitionist, and are queer, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi voices a part of this counter?
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to thank you for that question. It's so crucial. And, first of all, I'll say that I think, you're absolutely right that, the ways in which caste gets replicated in the diaspora is something that I think we really need to be paying very, very close attention to. And I've been so heartened and excited by some of the activist work happening here in the US around that, particularly groups like Equality Labs, who I think are doing tremendous work in terms of really pushing and articulating how caste gets replicated diasporically. So, I definitely think that there is absolutely the potential for what I'm calling these kind of, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora to push against Brahmanical Hinduism and caste hierarchies, absolutely. In my, so I sort of take this on. I wish in some ways, that I'd taken it on sort of more vociferously in that first chapter where I would talk about Kerala and the ways in which, I talk about this film, The Journey. I don't know if I have any stills from that film, but it's a film, that was made by a Malayali diasporic filmmaker, Liji Pullapalli, set in Kerala. And, in some ways it really romanticizes a kind of Nair matrilineal heritage, right? In the ways in which it's framing a kind of diasporic queerness. And so, I in my reading of the film, what I was trying to do is on the one hand, sort of articulate the ways in which the film, when I first saw it, had this really strong affective pull for me as somebody from the region, right? And so I was talking about the ways in which the region itself always has this very strong, like, emotive quality, right? Which can also be really regressive, as we know, right? The region isn't always queer or interesting, right? It can be super regressive. So that nostalgia, I mean, going back to Kiran, and the first book, talking about sort of an enabling nostalgia, or one that is actually, completely coherent with these kind of hierarchies, right? That film for me conjured up a certain kind of nostalgic affect that can also very easily tip into a very unreconstructed sort of rearticulation of these caste hierarchies, And so what I was trying to do in my reading of the film is sort of acknowledge the kind of affective pull these representations can have, while also recognizing the ways in which, that affective pull may very well be dependent on these Brahmanical hierarchies. And so how do you dislodge, how do you sort of recognize the ways in which these representations sort of push against certain hierarchies and replicate others? But I think, you're totally right. And I think, if I'm to, as I continue thinking and working, I've been really interested in learning more about the sort of aesthetic practices, the art practices that emerging that very specifically take on, caste apartheid in South Asia, and how that gets reasserted here in the diaspora. So thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, excellent question. And thank you, Professor Gopinath, for reminding us that we can always be more vociferous in our thinking about caste, especially for those of us who work on South Asia. You talked about region again, about how region can also be an aggressive kind of stance. The next question is from Anna Blatnik, who is at NYU Abu Dhabi, who asks you to elaborate a little bit more explicitly on the role of temporalities of the nation state. I think it came up briefly in the kind of dyad of nation and region that you had mentioned in your talk. So I believe that, and I would just like to hear more about where kind of temporality the figures in the nation state when you're exploring queerness.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where Shazia's work is interesting, because the temporality of the nation is very specific. We know this from all the scholars of nationalism, and particularly gender and nationalism, that have come before us, right? Like there's that constant sort of backward looking glance, right, of both the nation and diaspora, right? That can be extremely regressive, right? That can be all about sort of replicating, hierarchies around gender, around race, etc. So for me, what I've always been interested in, with the first book, for instance, is, going back to Kieran's sort of glossing the ways in which nostalgia worked in that book, right? For me, it was always about how that kind of backward glance can actually not simply replicate the hierarchies, but actually, dislodge them. So, I actually have in the first book, I have a whole chapter on Funny Boy, and I haven't seen the film yet, so I'm very curious to see what Mehta did with it. But so, for me, a book like Funny Boy was so interesting because it really allowed us to re-signify the diaspora through this kind of queer lens, right? So, what was being sort of recalled and remembered is not this kind of originary space that is pure and unsullied, right? It's in fact fraught and rent and, completely marked by all of these hierarchies, right? All of these fissures, all of these violences, in fact. And so to me, that's what the aesthetic does. It sort of conjures forth, or these aesthetic practices, right? What they do is conjure forth the past in a way that is attuned to their unruliness, right? And is attuned to their violences, right? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's a really useful frame to think about unruliness as a kind of atemporal kind of reading as well. We have actually lots of questions around writing and reading, I think based on kind of your talk and your introduction. So we have Nina Narayan would love to hear you speak more about your idea of a queer reading practice, and specifically the kind of theoretical and affective value of reading queerness into art and artists whose intrinsic queerness may be ambiguous or unknown.
Right.
And Nina writes that from a personal standpoint, I'm grappling with how to ethically write about queer artists who are not public about their queerness as a queer viewer and listener themselves. And I had this question as well, because you have a section in Unruly Visions on Agha Shahid Ali, where you mention explicitly that we can a kind of a homonormative reading of Agha Shahid Ali's work, it actually puts too much emphasis on a kind of melancholia or a nostalgia, and kind of doesn't read for the kind of some of the sharper work that it's doing. And you kind of also point to the problematic nature of the fact that Ali was never necessarily public about it, and that his queerness has always been kind of conjectured from various forms of writing and relationships. And so this is a really crucial question, I think.
Well, absolutely. And I so appreciate that question because, I mean, going back again, I mean, in relation to Shazia's work, right? Like, as I said, she's not an artist that's typically talked about in relation to queerness, right? And so, on the one hand, I want to move away from this kind of biographical sense, right? Of, is this artist queer or not, and think about, I am thinking about queerness as a kind of practice, right? As a kind of way of seeing, right? And so let me just say, so in relation to Shazia's work, what I'm trying to say is that if we read her work through that queer diasporic reading practice, through this kind of queer optic, we get a kind of different reading of embodiment, of gender, You know, it completely kind of explodes it in much more radical ways than we would have if we simply read her as this kind of feminist artist, right? Which is how she's typically talked about. But, you know, so on the one hand, you know, I'm using queer as precisely, you know, as the questioner mentioned, as this kind of reading practice, right? At the same time, you know, in relation to somebody like Agha Shahid Ali, what I found so interesting is that, you know, in a lot of the work written about him, there's a way in which the fact that there's a way in which his own queerness gets elided in the reading of the work. And so what I was trying to do, and I'm so glad, Arnav, you mentioned this, because, you know, what I was trying to do in my reading of his work is to, on the one hand, hold on to his own sort of self-identification. And so you have Amitav Ghosh, you know, who I reached out to, who was a very close friend of his, say to me, you know, I never asked him about that. And in fact, you know, his, you know, I just didn't think it was that important to have him articulate that. And what I realized is that he was articulating his queerness in the kind of friendship circles, in the interconnectedness of his world, right? The kind of social world that he created. And so, you know, if you think of like friendship as a way of life, you know, Foucault's beautiful essay, right? I mean, that's precisely the kind of queerness that that Agha Shahid Ali was enacting. But I also think, you know, you cannot really understand his poetry without understanding the impact of the ways in which, you know, at the core of some of those poems that I was reading, right, is the HIV positive body, you know, and his whole relation, again, this kind of queer relationality to, you know, when he was writing in the 80s at the height of the epidemic. And so if you simply talk about him as a writer of exile, which of course he was, then you miss, you know, this whole other way in which melancholia is operating, you know, that emerges out of loss, not just of homeland, but of homeland as well as community, as well as friendship, as well as lovers. And so that's the beauty of the work. And so I think what we have to do as scholars is to be mindful of all these different layers simultaneously. But, you know, I know we only have 1 minute left, but I will say, like, in relation to somebody like Akram Zaatari, you know, who's quite, you know, explicit about being a queer artist. You know, I shared my work with him, and I was actually quite nervous about, you know, I'm always nervous about sharing my work with the artists that I write about, because very often, you know, they may not see their work the way you see their work, right? But so when I shared my work with him, he had no problem with the queer part, you know. What he had a problem with was naming him as diasporic, you know. And so this is going back to Kareem's question, you know, or point, you know, in some ways. But he was very adamant that no, unlike my contemporaries who are now living in Paris or London or wherever, I did not leave. I'm still in Lebanon, you know. So he didn't like my framing of his work as the aesthetic practice of queer diaspora for the diaspora part. So I was trying to articulate for him, you know, actually, you know, I do see you as diasporic because I think of Saida as a diasporic site, Lebanon as a diasporic site, you know. So there's ways in which your work can has to be cognizant of the artist and who you're writing about in ways that you may not even imagine. Right? It's not just about the queerness. So.
Thanks so much, Gayatri. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I think you responded to many with much generosity, which we deeply appreciate as writers, grad students, independent scholars, people not in academia. I think this was a really generative talk and discussion for all of us, and we hope we can do another installment of this down the line. But thanks to everyone as well for making the time to attend.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure. It just lifted my spirits, you know, at exactly the moment when I needed it. So thank you so much for that. And also, Arnav, I wonder if there's a way in which you can send me the transcript so I can the chat so I can see the questions, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I will try to do that. I'm not sure how, but I will try and do that for you. But
Okay.
I think the 4 or 5 questions that you answered got to kind of the
Okay.
a couple of common ones, but I will make sure to send that to you
Okay.
for when
Well,
we do round 2.
Thank you for your wonderful moderation as well, Arnav. And thank you,
Thank
Karim and Kiran, as well.